Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, which is ISO 9001, Stage 2 for larger organisations. Just in case you're not familiar with NQA, we are a global certification body, and happily we're in the top 3 in the UK for 9001, 14,001, 45 and also now 27,001. So that's quite nice. At the end of this webinar, I will be able to show you a list of the training services which we provide, hopefully just to give you a little bit more knowledge and a little bit more comfort around the services that you provide and how that fits into your certification. And that is me, who will be presenting to you today. My name's Jude. And I've had a quick look at attendees and I can see there's a couple of people I know on there. So if I am your auditor, welcome. If I'm not, hopefully I will be one day. So it's just going to be a 45-minute webinar. You can put questions in the chat box. We will have a question and answer session at the end. And of course, as ever, the webinar will be recorded and will be circulated with the slides shortly after we've concluded the presentation. So this webinar came about really because a few of my clients are very large organisations, and if you go into, I suppose, Google and you put in together ISO 9001, it often comes up with the concept for smaller businesses rather than larger businesses, and I'm unsure if that's because it's sort of assumed that larger businesses will just automatically be able to get the certification, but that's not the case. So today we're going to look at the practical implementation of the differences between smaller and larger organisations for an ISO standard, how to prepare the organisation, the value that the audit can bring to your organisation, and the communications who should be involved in that stage 2 audit. So we'll start with why a larger organisation is different. Well, ISO 9001 can be seen as a corporate tool, and the elements of the standard might not reach everyone. So part of today's purpose is I'm going to do a whistle-stop tour through the standard, and certainly what some larger organisations have said in the planning for this webinar is that they might consider it before they go for stage 2 as maybe distributing it amongst everybody in the organisation so that everybody has a bit better idea in very lay speak what's expected at stage 2 and what the standard actually means from very, very top in the organisation to, you know, maybe even people who work part-time or, you know, are really the nuts and bolts of the business doing the day in, day out. The larger the organisation, the more pockets appear. So often what we'll see at stage 1 is a boardroom of top management, most definitely. And we'll spend a lot of that day going through what does your organisation do? How can you evidence to us that you'll be ready for a stage 2? Can we see bits? But we won't actually take evidence to put in that report, which will be the conduit of our information back to yourselves, the evidence that we've collected to say that you're okay to have ISO 9001. So on paper, we can see an organogram. It looks really, really simple, but the reality is the larger the organisation, you'll have a higher volume of people, which means that we've got more minds working and pockets appear, things that don't quite fit maybe in the scope or just elements that help the business tick over. The other thing we've identified is that people who've worked in other organisations prior to the one that may be going for a stage 2 might have experience of old 9001 standards. So this automatically sets off an expectation which is possibly no longer there anymore, such as documenting everything to the nth degree. You know, the older assessment methods, I suppose, when maybe we see more as inspectors than auditors who are coming in to assess what do, what do you say you do, and are you doing it? And really it's as simple as that. Well, I say it's as simple as that. There's a lot more to it from your end, but we'll run through that. And it's assumed that the more resource you've got makes it easier to create, run and achieve a 9001 system. From what I've seen in larger organisations, it actually makes it more complex, but we'll get through that and you might recognise some of these things as we go along. The good news is, if you've already had your stage 1 and you've been recommended for stage 2, the assessor has seen that you are at a state of readiness. If we've referred you and said, oh, okay, you've got lots of areas of concern and we're not quite there yet, then it's still worthwhile continuing with the webinar and hopefully give you a few top tips of how we can get through that stage 1 based on the fact that we're looking at a stage 2. But the assessor has already seen a lot of what you're doing. So it means that we are confident that you should, if you address areas of concern, be okay for certification. And what the stage 2 will do is we'll look throughout the company in different areas, we'll meet more people and we'll actually review and collect that evidence. So although there's a lot of misconception generally around the staff that haven't been involved in the stage 1, we can with confidence go forward and say if we've done the stage 1, then the stage 2 is certainly achievable. So the first thing as an organisation, what you'll need to consider is how to prepare everybody in that organisation. And there's certain things really that we would expect people to know. And the problem with the ISO standards is it becomes a language of its own, and sometimes that can put people off a little bit. So everybody in the business should be aware of what the scope is. And the scope will be documented, as will maintain the support of the operational processes, and that will provide everybody with confidence of how the processes work. So if we put that into lay speak, the assessor should be able to go to anybody in the business and say, what is it that you do? Now, if you're a construction company, you might have lots of elements in your scope. You might have design, installation, supply, distribution, many different facets, and we wouldn't expect absolutely everybody in the organisation, if they don't deal with installation, to know about the installation side. We would expect them, if they work in procurement, for example, or the commercial region, to know about that element of the scope. And of course, at this stage, you won't have your certificate with the scope documented, but it should be somewhere within your business management system, or at least communicated to everybody. Within that, we would also then expect that within each department of the business, that you will have some form of processes, something you can hang your hat on, that you can go back to and say, right, this is what I do, and you can verify that I do it by looking at this. And it might be a flow chart, it might be a documented process, it might be a form of training, perhaps, that you can show us. Interested parties isn't often a term that's used in day-to-day business throughout the scope of staff, but we will certainly ask everybody, you know, who are your customers? What do your customers mean to you? Who is affected by your company? And how can others affect your company? So it's very rare that we'd use those terms, interested parties, with people other than the top management. There's no right or wrong answer, and generally the answers that we are provided with, we can often go back to some form of documentation or a management interview, and we'll see that it's cohesive, it turns inside. Internal and external issues. So regardless of our role, we all have these. So in the standard, you don't have to document internal and external issues. It's generally a conversation. You can produce a register, you can produce a spreadsheet. It's entirely up to you as the organisation. But when we talk about internal and external issues in general conversation with your staff and people who are using the processes, they will all have their own. You know, it might be a case of, oh, well, we have this process, but sometimes it doesn't talk to another department, or sometimes this happens and as a result, X affects me. External issues might be, well, we always use this supplier, but unfortunately we're having issues at the moment. There's many different things, and by documenting that as a large organisation, as a register, in some respects you're shooting yourself in the foot, because you can't possibly get round the whole organisation and find out what is an internal and external issue to everybody. But what can be significant is if we then speak to the top management and they know about everybody's, but it's very rare that that would happen. So it's just about appreciating really that we're hitting the elements of the standard and that people are aware. We'll look at what processes do we follow. Now, with a larger organisation, what we've generally found is it's generally a software-led system. It's not the usual that we would go in and we've got a paper quality manual, a lever arch file, and that we've got paperwork instructions and bits flying about everywhere else. There's generally been an investment or a requirement to have it as a software system. It might be a client-led process, but we would be looking at change requests, work instructions. It's literally, if you're not part of the management watching this, what do you do? How do you know how to do it? And that's all we're interested in on assessment day in regards to the organisation and the processes which you'll follow. Now, if you've seen one of my webinars before, you'll know that I absolutely love this model because it's visual and it shows a couple of things. So firstly, everybody within the business is valuable and everybody is working towards the same goal. Now, in a larger organisation, the top 4 lines there become far larger part of the audit, because although we've got the people who are responsible for making the product or service happen, there are generally functions which are required to support these activities, and they're quite critical to the business. So in a smaller business, just as an example, you might have people wearing many hats, where you've got somebody who's working receiving goods, but then they'll also go and do something on a manufacturing line. In a larger business, we find that's not generally the case. You've generally got specific people doing specific things. So when we look at the volume of people and we think lots of resources, that resource is often pushed to the maximum. So it's quite difficult to start introducing new things as an absolute whole. And we recognise that. But it's important to remember that regardless of what you role in the business, you are all working to the same objective, and that objective should be that you are engaging and following the quality or business management system as set by the organisation. So I think it might be interesting for people who aren't involved in the leadership aspect of the audit to understand that element. So the top management and leadership is more complex in larger organisations. There's more levels and potentially a distanced approach. So what we mean by that is if you've got 100, maybe 500 employees and you work on that site, you own that business, it's often a lot easier to get round people, to speak to people, to get opinions and know exactly what's going on the ground floor. But often in a much larger organisation, you might have 5,000 employees, you might have 10,000, and you might have above that. So it would be quite unusual, therefore, for the top management or leader to be able to have that level of interaction. It's more common, in fact, for people in those positions to have absolutely no time in the diary because they are busy directing the business, getting business in and ensuring that those 5,000 to 10,000 employees are responsible enough to do the role that they've been tasked to do, and they can work on that aspect which they need to. So it is quite different, and what comes with that is when you're so far removed from the ground floor, for want of a better word, things get lost in translation. So what you think might be happening might not actually be happening, and that can happen from both sides as well. You might feel there's not so much communication, but that's why we have the structure and the managers. The other thing to consider is that when the managers and the supervisors disseminate information, they're not going to disseminate absolutely everything. It's got to be relevant to what you do, relevant to your role, and your KPIs need to be relevant. So at stage 2, we really need to see that how from the top of the leadership, how you get through every department of that business. And it's absolutely fine to pass that to managers who can then pass it to supervisors and team leaders, as long as it gets filtered through what it is you want as part of the leadership. We have no issue with that. We will meet the standard. Now, because it's not health and safety 45001, although it's preferable, we don't always need to speak to the entire top management. So we might be thinking board level here, we might be thinking CEO, might be thinking the owner of the business. It's okay for them to delegate that down. Let's think of an example. So if we were to look at the armed forces, just strictly as a technicality, the leader, the head of the armed forces is Her Majesty the Queen. It is not likely that she would have the time or the want, if we're honest, to spend half an hour to discuss ISO 9001, because although she is the head of it, she's delegated that authority and delegated that suitability to other people to run those forces for her. And that might be the same, in the case of Richard Branson. We probably wouldn't get to speak to him, definitely not now, because he's in space at this current time, I believe. So it's important that we recognise that if the leadership has been delegated to fulfil the day-to-day running, we can go with that. And that's the organisation's decision to make. Now, clearly, if we can't find an input from the leadership or the next top, maybe from the Queen, we would be looking to, well, who is actually creating objectives, who is enforcing the policy, and what the leader, the top leader, is signing to. Is that actually happening? So the policy and the objectives we will generally see in large organisations is signed off from the very, very, very top. And part of our role as the assessor is to ensure that what they've signed to as that head of is happening. Another part we're going to be looking at following through the standard is going to be planning. The requirement of planning is to ensure the system can achieve its objectives, plan actions to address risks and opportunities, and achieve improvement. So ISO 9001 within a large organisation becomes very, very complex, because if you think about it, the amount of employees you have, the amount of departments that you have, each is going to have its own set of KPIs, its own objectives, and each is going to have its own risks and its own opportunities to find. But hopefully everybody can find improvement somewhere. So in a large organisation, you might find that you have a set of group objectives, and you might call them visions, you might call them values. That's okay. It's up to us to find the evidence under what terminology you decide to put in there. And then presumably your managers, team leaders, your supervisors will look at what's happening in their division and may set localized objectives. That's okay. But from an ISO point of view, we need to know that as one business, as one organization, there are carefully planned objectives with KPIs, that it ties in with the policy, and they're all risk-based if possible. This is everybody's responsibility to work towards those objectives. So the communication of these is critical, absolutely critical. We do expect all staff to know their role in the system and their department objectives, and we'll dig deeper with the top management as to how and why they're set. So what we will probably ask people who want management is, what's your objective? Where are you at with it? And we don't expect people to run off a list of 40 objectives from memory. It doesn't add value to anybody. But what they might do is say, well, I can show you those. They're on my business management system, or we have them, well, when we're not all working from home, we have them on a notice board over here, and we'll have a meeting about them every quarter, or so on and so forth. Everybody should understand and have access to the policy. We don't expect people to be able to recite it, but we do expect people to know what part they play. So again, you're looking at an A4 piece of paper that will cover upwards of 1,000 employees. That's not a small task. But what will generally happen within the policy for larger organisations is it will be customer focused, and it will be risk focused, and very on board with the training and compliance of everybody within the company. Now, if you're in a large organisation, which you probably are if you're in this webinar, you will probably be aware of the planning of changes. So particularly, and this is a huge difference, smaller companies will generally deal with a rollout, a bang, bang, bang effect of getting product out, or maybe contracts that last 6 months, slightly longer, but they're not likely to be as complex, given they'll have a smaller amount of people to deal with. So you're running a construction company, you're going to have changes constantly throughout that, and that will be environmental, it'll be down to customer, staff changes, subcontractor problems. Whoever works with a customer on a long-term contract, and some of these things can run up to 10 years, depending what industry that you're in, it would be highly unusual for that first planning meeting to not have any change 10 years later. So this is where we often find a lot of audit findings, because they don't always show or reflect how we've come to these conclusions. So as part of the plan of changes, if we change one process or one element of the system, is it going to affect another? Now, if you've got documented processes and procedures, and again, you've got up to maybe 1,000 people or more using them, it's a hot spot, because you think, right, I need to change that because this is going to help me with my role for my customer and my element of the work. And sometimes what happens when you do that is it will affect another department, and they might not know because we've not updated that and we've not put the challenge through as a collective to say, is this going to work better, and then update what's needed. There's also the challenge of resources as well. People coming into new projects, people leaving projects. We find that a lot more common in larger organisations. So of course, if you're going to plan for that change, you've got to look at lots of different things. Have they got the competence to join the team, the experience to join the team? Is the project ready for somebody else to come in, or have we over-resourced? Can we let somebody go and place them somewhere else in the business? It's an absolute minefield, the changes element. There's also statutory and regulatory requirements as well, so it's not a small feat in terms of legislation may change. More regulations can come through, particularly in the Brexit arena at the moment. It's, I suppose, expected that change will come in regulations and perhaps legislation as well. So we're all sort of on the back foot, waiting for that to happen. And of course, this may change projects that you're currently working on. You may be most familiar with the customer requirement often changing as well. I don't want to buy this one anymore. I don't want you to make this one anymore. I want you to do this instead. So what we've found is that process users often find a different or better way to conduct their part. But if the change is not planned and actually in the system, this is likely to become a non-conformance at your stage 2 audit. So we mentioned the word pockets earlier at the beginning of this presentation, and it's these pockets which sometimes lose a little bit of control where we find better ways, and that's not a negative thing. If we can find a better way, a more effective way, it's just how do we plan that into the system and show the assessor that we've actually done that. And ways of doing it are writing out a change request, getting it authorised, putting it to a quality board or a quality team if your organisation's large enough to have one, and making these decisions. And a good way of showing an assessor that is keeping meeting minutes, or if you want to do it as a PowerPoint presentation, which is often a good conduit for a larger business, keep it, show the assessor. It just shows us that you are using thought and planning effectively. The next element is support. So it's up to the organisation to determine what resources are needed, how they're implemented, and the maintenance and continual improvement of the quality management system. So we'll be looking at what internal resources you have determined that you require, what we need for external providers, people who can follow and bring improvement to the system, and your work environment such as internet buildings, transport, social, physical and psychological factors, and the monitoring of resources, maintaining fitness for purpose, traceability, which could be your documents, but it could be something that's a physical aspect such as calibration. So the first thing that probably the assessor will do is come into your building, hopefully COVID permitting, and look at what it's like as a working environment there. Now, if you're working remotely and you have not a great internet, or you have people working in the field for you that have a wonderful system on their laptop that they can refer to for risk assessments, method statements, policies, procedures, procurement forms, policies, everything you could possibly want, but they can't access anything because of lack of internet and signal, then that's something that we'll probably talk to the management about and find out what is the way around that. If all your meetings are online and you can't access them, or it's a constant buffer, we'll probably look into internal resources. Are we looking to fix that particular problem? Because of course communication is quite a critical part of 9001. We'll look at your buildings as well in terms of, are they suitable? Are they fit for purpose? So if, for example, and I'm sure this is never the case, it's a terrible example. If, for example, you've got the top management with a whole floor to themselves with plasma TVs and lovely plush couches, and then you've got the administration and general office staff 40 to one small room, we would probably say it's not entirely suitable, and feed that into your social, physical and psychological factors. So these are the things we will also be asking your staff for in terms of collection for evidence. What's it like to work here? Do you feel supported? Is the building fit for purpose? And there has been occasions where you've gone in and perhaps they've got no toilet, especially on building sites. They haven't put the right welfare in, or even in more corporate settings, there can be, just basics missing, and that in itself could produce a finding for you. Organisational knowledge is something that we will absolutely look at. Now, it's always a strong area in my experience with people in large organisations, and generally because there's lots of corporate flyers or brochures that we can look at and go back to. But when we talk about organisational knowledge from an ISO 9001 perspective, we don't need to know that the company was started in 1967, although it's very nice to do that. We're talking about the here and now for everybody. So everybody in the organisation knows, again, this is our goal, this is what we do. If I have an issue, this is who I go to. If I'm unsure or find something wrong, I go to this person, and either it stops there for them or they're part of that continuing process of people rectifying or looking a bit closer into it. We also look at competence, and this is the age-old argument, and many have argued, in fact, that I shouldn't have a driving licence. I would agree, but somebody deemed me competent on the day to pass my driving test. Doesn't mean that I'm a good driver. So we do ask for evidence in terms of maybe they've done a course which requires a certificate. We can look at that and see that we've done continual training. And it's not just the people doing the job that we would look for with that, it's right the way through the company. If you've been appointed in management, how did the company determine that you were capable and have the competence to lead your group of people? We might have somebody who is responsible for engineering projects. How have we determined that they are suitable to do that role? Now, it doesn't always have to be external certificate unless there's a statutory requirement for that. You might have a good internal training process. You might have a good internal way of determining criteria for that. And if that's what the company has determined, that's absolutely fine. We cannot tell you as an assessor any different unless it's a statutory requirement. Awareness, huge area. The whole standard really is about awareness, risk, and continual improvement. So if we've come across people who aren't aware you have a policy or aren't aware of the global objectives of the company and what their contribution is, it's likely to become a finding. So the contribution from people is really important. So 9001 recognises that everybody's contribution is important, and it's whether they're on the payroll or whether you've actually contracted somebody in to do a role, whether it's cleaning, cooking, auditing. We need to know that they are aware of your objectives and your policies, and that while they're working within your contract, they're adhering to your business management system. Communication is something which is a heavy topic with the top management for the assessors. So they're going to determine what, when and how the information is communicated and to who. And when we get that information from the top management, we are testing that to a certain degree. So we'll slip in things to people on the ground floor. Have you received this? Do you know about this? And that's probably the best way that we can check what is the communication like. So we don't expect everybody in the organisation to know absolutely everything. That's not what organisational knowledge means. Do they know their role and what is happening in the company? Documented information are total main findings on this for larger companies, because what seems to happen is that you start off, and it's probably a hangover, in fairness, from the old 9001 systems. If you've had them before, you have got hundreds of reams of paperwork absolutely everywhere. It's not controlled, which is a main part of the documented information reason, really, is that we can find it, we know what version, we know who's created it, and if that person's left the company, we've reviewed it and we've said it's suitable by somebody in the company. People can't always find what's needed. So if you say, I have a process whereby I can trace or order for the laptops for everybody who has to work from home. We've done 3 orders for it. I'm going to ask to see those 3 orders. If it takes you half an hour to find them, it says, you know, perhaps your system isn't as good or your process isn't as good as it could be. So these are factors that we take into consideration. Now, obviously, if you produce the documentation, it's not going to be a finding, but it could be an opportunity to improve. That if you're struggling to find it for us, if you really need to find something at some point, you're wasting a lot of time, and it's all about that efficiency, isn't it? Sometimes the information isn't accessible. So if you're reliant on the internet, please make sure that your signal is good and that it's a reliable source. Because a lot of the time we see a lot of frustration from people saying it's here, it's definitely here, and you get the blue spinning circle of death or your screen freezing. If it's not accessible and we can't see it, then unfortunately it's likely to be a finding. Out-of-date versions, this is the curse of the larger organisation, I'm afraid, because there's always one who saves something to their own laptop. As your system evolves, this is possibly going to be one of the largest jobs that you have. archive and get everything that you don't need or don't use or is just totally out of date. And it's a really common finding. I probably raise this at least 3 times a month, which might not sound a lot, but it is certainly one of the most common findings that I certainly come across. Things being saved incorrectly. So you can have project plans, customer plans, really, really detailed, fantastically filled out, but there's always one thing that we just can't find, and it's just because it's not been saved in the right place. So it's important when you do your internal audits that you pick on these small, maybe pedantic elements, but it's what the standard requires for which we need the certificate. So it's really good to interrogate these parts of your process. We might have had a procedural change that says that within this, so say contract review, for example, that you will produce a quote for every inquiry and you'll produce an acknowledgement letter for every order received. Once you realise that producing a quote before, you know, perhaps we've got a little bit more information, you might change your procedure to say that we don't need a quote, this is taking too much time. If I pick up your procedure that says you're producing a quote and you've 6 months or no quotes, of course, I'm going to have to raise that as a finding. So it's really important when you look at your procedures and procedure you're following, if you're not doing something in that anymore, it needs changing. Or if you've added something, it needs changing. Don't give the auditor ammunition. Probably the best way to put it. So documented information, it's everybody's responsibility. Everybody uses it in some shape or form, and it is the most common way to find a negative finding. I think maybe at stage 2, the operational side of things is really, really strong in most large organisations we go to. The reason for that is you do it day in, day out, you do it very well in most circumstances. When we look to assess that, it can become a little bit of a worry for a lot of people because, again, it's that terminology. All it's going to come down to is, have you determined the requirements for the products and services, and can you meet what the customer wants? Now, you might have one customer, even as a huge organisation, that tells you what your requirements will be. They might provide your budget and do everything for you. It's not too unusual, that, but it's still the onus on the business to see whether you can actually meet what that customer wants, and that's going to take a lot of communication and the simple stuff: inquiries, contracts, changes, feedback, how you look after customer property, and then contingency plans. So whatever area in the business, and this is more less a leadership element but everybody working in the business element, most people will have come across one element of that, and these are the things that we look for evidence. How have you managed it? And again, we'll always go back to the process to see, are you following it? We can't just make it up and say, but you should do it this way. That's not our role. The leadership have determined it. We will see, is it being followed? And that's it. Again, we go back to statutory and regulatory. Can we meet the claims for the products and services? So if we're looking, for example, at buying acids, you know, so that we can put it in a product to send to our customer, have we met the statutory demands for that? If we're looking at selling firearms, have we met the statutory requirement for that? Do we know the regulations? Have we thoroughly put these aspects into the processes so that we can ensure we can meet what the customer wants? And there'll be lots of elements around those bits, and quite common as well. If there is a change, don't worry, document it. As we said with documented information, it's critical. Another area for larger businesses we find problems with is design, development and planning. So we're generally working that fast on so many projects that things, again, do occasionally get a little bit lost in translation. So we need to go back to the basics 100% with a lot of this stuff. So what's the nature of duration? We need to document this. What are the process stages? Who is going to verify and validate it? And what is that verification and validation? Who is going to be responsible for those involved? What resources do we need? And the control of interfaces between persons, which is how the standard puts it. But basically what we are saying with that is that you need meetings and you need to document meetings, and we need to be able to see how we've encountered issues, if not issues, how we've actually verified what we've been saying. The customer input is absolutely critical in all of this, because we can't generally say that a design has been signed off and okay unless it's done so by the customer themselves and the levels of control put in. And this is a very problematic area for large organisations, again, because of the amount of people that are generally involved in those. So we need to document this. So this isn't necessarily, again, part of the leadership element. This is people within the business that need to know and be conscious of their role, responsibility, and awareness of the management system. There's lots of parts of the design element of the standard you can function in to your BMS, really, because it's really the whole standard in one section. So looking at your performance inputs, previous designs that might provide value, you might find that in your management system of, well, this was working really well, but we're just going to tweak it just so we can develop it and make it a little bit better. Statutory and regulatory, standards and codes of practice, and that's worth mentioning. In terms of your general processes, it may not just be statutory and regulatory that you have to comply with. There may be codes of practice that you need to consider as well. And of course, they should be part of your processes so that people know this is what I need to adhere to. Potential failure and consequence, we could say that about any part of the system. What results do we need to achieve and how we meet the requirements. All of these items, and you'll get these slides, are what we are expecting to see as part of stage 2. And what we'll generally do is take a sample of more than 2. My personal sample is 5. I like to take 5 or 6 of everything. Each assessor is different. Huge area for large businesses. What you normally have is a very extensive list of suppliers, generally because you've been going for a long time. Predating the standard, we're going to have really good long-standing relationships. We're going to have customers who say don't use anybody but this particular company, but you still have to show how you're controlling that, and the people who are doing the commercial aspect of procurement need to be able to show how we're doing that. So it might include a pre-qualification questionnaire. You can show us those by all means. Good evidence all the time. And your company judgment, that might just simply be to say, yeah, worked with them a long time, no problem. You might say we start everyone at 100%. And then if there's an issue with the supplier, then we'll mark them down and we'll review it. But it's your responsibility as the company to ensure and communicate the requirements to be met, the approval of product and service, the methods, how the product's released, the competence of the provider as well, and the verification and validation of activities. So if you're going to hire a logistics firm to transport to your customer, then we need to make sure everybody's got driving licenses. They might have a drink and drugs policy in place, that they haven't got really old, damaged, awful vehicles. There's lots that goes into it, and ways you might be able to provide evidence is, as a larger company, you might have auditors, you might have an audit team that go and look at your suppliers, you might sample quality checks of documentation that comes through, and you might even have a customer aftercare service to ensure that after delivery you get a thorough feedback from your customers. Was everything okay, and did we meet it? And of course, as ever, changes throughout that should be documented if you have to move supplier. More and more in audits, what we're finding is that have you got any non-conformances? Yes, and they're all coming as a result of an internal audit, and it's not always totally realistic that. So we need to deal with products or services that don't conform. And if it's a physical product, you might look at segregation or containment. You might look at informing the customer or an authorization for acceptance or concession. Or either way, we need to correct it. And we need to document these steps. So non-conformances are absolutely fine. They're great tools of information. If we find that we've done something that isn't quite there, it's absolutely no problem. All we need to do is look at how that happened, correct it, and learn from it. It's the process which is broken, not the person who's on the name of the non-conformance. So we don't need to worry too much. But it is something that larger companies get a little bit bogged down with. We have a tendency to try and fix things at the time. However, the problem with that is you then can't look at trends. You can't say, well, you know, this is something that we need to look at. And whatever the non-conformance is, it costs. There's a financial cost to it. And whether it's 20 quid here and there, you might be a multi-million pound organisation. 20 quid can turn into 200, can turn into 2,000. So it's really important that everybody knows, and here's an incentive for you. The 20 quid we're paying to fix your non-conformance could have been your bonus. There you go. Obviously not everybody would be doing that. I'm sorry, I'm overrunning slightly. I'll speed up. So evaluation to monitor its effectiveness will be set by the top management. This is their function. What, how, when, and what was the results? What do we do with the results? This is absolutely critical. But that again is a top management function. We need to look at customer satisfaction. We need to determine the methods to capture perception. Now, this is a top management function, but it's a responsibility of everybody in the business. If you get a little niggle on the phone when you're saying, we've done this for you, were you happy with it? Yeah, I was generally, but you know, I spoke to someone the other day and they weren't too positive about it, or, well, yeah, but you said it'd be on this time. But anyway, we've got it now, so it's all right, don't worry about it. This is all part of customer perception, and you might even want to include it as perhaps something as a non-conformance to look into, because when your customer is speaking to you, it's a really positive thing. If it's something that they don't like, it's great, they're telling you, you can change it. If they're not telling you, they're telling everybody else. And particularly if it's, you know, something you're building, you're making, or you're providing, and your company is big, people love to talk about it. So it's really important that everybody takes responsibility for customer satisfaction. Analysis is another leadership function, but it's good for all levels to get involved with it. So we've gathered it all, and we're going to look at conformity of products and services, customer satisfaction, how are the systems performing, and what we've planned, has it been implemented effectively? So it's everybody's responsibility to come on board with this and have a look. And are we doing what we've been told to do, what we've been asked to do? If it doesn't work, tell them, give them the opportunity to fix it. There might be a reason why top management can't do something, because again, it might be a case of, I need to change this, it doesn't work for me. Yes, but it doesn't work for the other department and you're going to produce more work. So it's really, really important. Internal audits, everybody in the business should be aware of, because at some point you're probably going to be part of it. We have to plan the audit. There's no harm in doing an ad hoc one, as long as you've got the authorization and ability to do so. But all we're trying to do is see, does the system conform to its own intended purpose, beg your pardon. It's not about the person doing the job. If you're following what's written down or what you've been directed to do, It can never be your fault. It's the process. And everybody in a large organisation, the key to life is making it easy and getting the most out of the day, and everybody doing it. It's not a case of, you know, wanting to make things harder for people at all. That just doesn't work in a large environment. You're going to look at how often you do it, how you're actually going to do it, and who's taking responsibility for it. We're going to look at the scope for each audit as well. You need to select auditors who are objective and impartial to the audit process. And the internal audit aspect, please don't leave to your external auditor. Unfortunately, we can't go in and say, yes, I'm verifying that your audit process was okay because you've raised findings or you haven't. You have to have somebody within your organisation who can oversee the audit process. And it doesn't matter if you want to split internal audit so it goes across all of the processes. Resource-wise, totally understand you can't take somebody out of the business for the entire day to cover all of the functions of 1,000+ people. It wouldn't be effective and it wouldn't work. So it might be from a leadership point of view an idea to appoint internal audit teams, internal audit focus groups, committee meetings, and although we recognise it's a resource, this is the leadership tool to find how is the business functioning, what are we getting out of, where are the problems, where are the good things, and it's vital to the success of the business. And because of that, we'll report to the relevant management and we leave that to them to do what they need to do with that, again, as part of that leadership function. If you've not been in a management review before and you're not part of the leadership, this is what is on the agenda. So the management, and again, talking at the size of businesses that we're looking at, you might have a huge board of sometimes 50 people, 20 people, who knows, depends on the size of the business and who's involved. But all of them, right to the very, very top, you might not see it, but it does happen. The head, even the Queen, if we're looking at the armed forces, would have to look at the management review and even be part of it. And we've got to look at the actions from previous meetings. We've got to look at the external and internal issues. We've got to look at everything really that we've just spoken about in the last 52 minutes. Really critical stuff. So whilst we're doing the day-to-day and we're beetling along, it might not feel like this is going straight up to the top, but it is. And it's our input as the day-to-day workers that provides the leadership with all of this wonderful information. And this is how they make decisions in relation to the system. And this is the, I suppose, if you were wanting to know, really the context of the questions that we ask the top leadership. And if we find inconsistencies, it's them that we pose the questions to and try and get to the bottom of, rather than the people on the ground. A large incentive of the ISO standards is to reduce risk, but also to improve. And that's what it's all about. People, we need to improve our product or service, correct or prevent undesired effects, and improve the performance of the system. And just because we're customer focused doesn't mean the customer's always right, but maybe that could be part of the improvement of how, you know, reading different customers, customer perception, it all comes back to the very, very basics. The final part is nonconformity and corrective action. Again, don't be scared of nonconformities. We don't care if you've got 5,000 employees and 80,000 nonconformances logged. I mean, obviously as the business, head of the business, you might do, because that's a lot of resource to sort of go through. But all it shows us is that if there is a flaw in the process, we can see that you, as a company, no matter what the size, you can react. You've taken action to control it, you've corrected it, and with whatever consequences, we've dealt with it. That's all the assessor wants to know. And a common finding is, again, we follow a process. Oh yeah, we know about that. We haven't done anything about it yet. That's when we'll start making a finding. So if you have hundreds of outstanding actions, which I have seen for internal audits, we've identified the problems, but we've not done anything. Or if when we go to site and we can see, again, I'll use construction because it's such a complex industry with so many subcontractors and so many people and activities to manage, we will generally find lots of non-conformities and they're not reported, and then we have to raise it as a formal finding. I think we've just discussed that. I've got too excited ahead of myself there, but you're going to evaluate the need for action, eliminate the cause, and just to ensure that it doesn't happen again. Things will happen because we are human beings. So the takeaway, hopefully for this, for the stage 2, is that you've got to work as a team, all of you. We have to make sure that the top management, who are going to be the smallest part of the company in terms of volume of people, that yes, you know what your responsibilities are, but also that you've fed down or up in the case of this to your larger base of supervisors, managers, team leaders. Make sure that your will of what you want out of the system is fully explained, that they know what is expected of the system, the objectives, the policies, the processes, the KPIs. Equally, from there, this needs to be distributed amongst the main body of workers, because we are quite good at just spotting people, especially if they hide, and going over and saying hello to them and having those conversations, not in a nasty way. We're quite sociable people, really, often boring as well, we're told as assessors, but you know, we're sociable, we try. The organogram generally for company structures has the top management at the top of the pyramid. And we know they're very important people with lots of responsibility, far too much responsibility in some cases and too little time. But for a stage 2, they are going to form a very small part of the whole thing. We want to know, are they aware of their responsibilities as far as 9001 are concerned? We're then going to assess, has this been disseminated to people who can lead it and take it on a day-to-day level? And our main focus is going to be the main body of key workers throughout your company. Does the awareness stop at leadership and management, or does everybody know? Is everybody engaged? And just to reassure anybody who is not in management, we're literally just there to ask the question time and time again. What do you do? Show me what you do. It works. That's good. We do have more training available, and I'll leave you to look through all this when you get the slides. And there we go. We did say at the beginning as well, you could have a list of the advanced training courses that we do. So the webinars are sort of general information, really. If you want a more advanced look into the theory, then these are the courses that we're offering. You can get in touch with us about that if you're interested. And I can see that we've possibly got a few questions there now as part of this. I'm going to see. So we have one question. What are the top 3 common findings you've encountered during the COVID era? Excellent. In the main, people working from home, a large organisation should focus on its stage 2 assessment. I can tell you that straight away. We cannot find information. That is the critical part, really. So when I mentioned about are things accessible, that has been the main thing. We know we've got things, but we can't find them. Equally, in terms of statutory and regulatory, large organisations, you will have to have risk assessments for COVID-19, and you will have to have some form of communication as part of your welfare for return to works or at home, and they have been a little bit thin on the ground. So that's probably number 2 finding for me in terms of the support element that we mentioned, and also the statutory aspect. And the third common finding in the COVID era, I would probably say, is communication. It's been very hit and miss in large organisations. There's generally been maybe a couple of emails that have gone out from top leadership. And then it's been some have been absolutely great. They've had WhatsApp groups. They've been able to evidence that they've put everything onto Teams, really. But actually finding how have we captured the communication of any changes, want of a better word, down the ranks, that has certainly been another finding. So those would be my top three. And so I've got a question about 27,001. Unfortunately, I don't assess that, so I wouldn't like to provide any advice on it. But if you get in touch with Tim Pennell, he would happily be able to talk you through that. So those are the only questions. I'd like to thank you for attending, and I'm closing the webinar. Thank you.